So anyway, send me your email, and my email address is just kpyocom, so that's kpyocom at hotmail.com. kpyocom at hotmail.com. If you'll send me your email address, that way if anything does happen, I will send you an email and tell you kind of how we're getting together. So I'm going to back up just a little ways, as I generally do, but we were looking at the bowls of wrath and the 7 bowls of wrath. And when the 7th angel had poured out his bowl on the great river, the Euphrates, the water was dried up so that the way of the would be prepared for the kings from the east. If we were to look back at the, let's just say, I'm going to, in a little bit, we'll be wanting to look at some things in Daniel. That's where I was looking last. But in Revelation chapter 10, let's see, I want to go to the 6th, the 6th trumpet. Let me go back to chapter 9, just the end of chapter 9, to pick up the context of that. So in the end of chapter 9, you'll see that he says in verse 14, he said, one saying to the 6th angel who had the trumpet, release the 4 angels that are bound at the great river Euphrates. You see that, in other words, it's saying the same thing. The 6th angel with the 6th trumpet is the same, almost exactly the same, as the 6th angel pouring out his bowl of wrath. And so I know that many believe that all of the Christians will be gone after the Great Tribulation before the bowls of wrath. However, as I was telling you last week, there is some reason to believe, at least be open to the fact that the second coming of Christ, all of that takes place between the 6th and 7th of each of the events. And so here you'll see that same thing. The 6th angel poured out his, sounded his trumpet, and it will tell us then, that's the 6th, and it'll tell us all these same things. And then when we get in the next chapter, like in chapter 10, I saw another strong angel coming down out of heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was like the sun, and his feet like pillars of fire. He had in his hand a little book that was open. Let's see. I want to see. But he says here in verse 6, and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created the heavens and the earth, and things in it, the earth and the things in it, and the sea and the things in it, that there will be no delay no longer. But in the days of the voice of the 7th angel, when he is about to sound, then the mystery of God is finished, as he preached to his servants the prophet. And so it's the 7th trumpet. We know that the trumpet will sound, the dead in Christ will rise first, then those that are alive and remain will be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, and so shall they, and be caught up to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall they ever be with the Lord. And so this 7th angel, that's the last trumpet. At the last trumpet, it's the same thing then that we see in Revelation chapter 16, where the 6th angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, again, preparing the way for the kings of the east. And then you'll remember possibly from last week, but anyway, I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs, spirit of demons, which go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. And as I mentioned then, from verse 14 to verse 16, it's a continuation of the thought. They gather them together to the place which is in the Hebrews called Armageddon or Harmageddon. But in between that is a parenthetical statement that says, behold, I'm coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked and men will not see his shame. So that's the last place we see this deal of I am coming like a thief, and this warning. And so again, it's in exactly the same place as with the 7th trumpet, when the 7th trumpet sounds. And you'll also see many, there's some other things that correspond, and we'll talk about that possibly as time goes on. So that's where we got to last week. And then the seventh bowl. So then the seventh angel poured out his bowl upon the air. A loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." So in the other place it was, "It is finished, it is done. There shall be delay no longer." It's said in different ways in the different places. But either way, that's the end of it. So this is the end. And then he'll talk about there were flashes of lightning, sounds and peals of thunder. There was a great earthquake, such as was not since man was upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. And I thought about going back and showing you that again, but you may remember that when this happens, that there will be 7 thunders that will utter their voices. And he'll begin to write that and prepare to write it. And the angel says, don't write that down. But then, is what he tells them, that in the day of the 7th trumpet. So, not to write it. And so there are flashes of lightning, sounds and peals of thunder, great earthquake. This earthquake, I believe, will be different than any earthquake has ever been. Well, it says so. A great earthquake such as has not been since man came to be upon the earth, so great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. Not the 2 that were felt in Odessa today, but this one, I believe, is going to be quite a bit different. Now, in these earthquakes, so you'll remember that in the cataclysm, in the what you might call the extinction event, that apparently the earth probably was hit by, I've told you that my opinion is it probably was hit by a comet, a great ball of ice that probably hit in what is now the crater is the Gulf of Mexico, and knocked a large chunk of the earth out on the far side, and so deep that it created a great rift and crater down in the Pacific. I think it's something like 5 miles deep in that area that probably came out of that. But all of the crust around the earth, prior to that time, there were rivers, but there was no sea. There was only rivers, though there would have been streams, maybe lakes. Rivers there were, because it lists the rivers in Genesis. But this crust was over the whole earth. But when this happens, the foundations of the deep, the fountains break open, and the water comes out upon the earth, and there is floods of water. And the floods of water will gradually run off and fill in those voids that were created. So the earth is again round, but it's rounded because many of the plates are submerged. They've gone under the other plates, and so they go under it. And so you can go up to the Rocky Mountains, let's say, and you can see places where there are great rocks that are jutted way up into the air. They are great sea, very obvious sea floor. There's fossils of sea creatures that can be found way high in the mountains, and that's not only true in Colorado, but even in New Mexico there are places that are like that, where that sea fossils, even though it may be 5,000, 4,000 feet in the air, or up in some of the Rocky Mountains, it may be a lot higher than that. And yet these great, what was the seabed is just jutting up into the air. And many places, the plates have sunk down, and as they move along each other, they cause volcanoes and earthquakes like the ones that we're feeling now as they move across each other and as they create friction, and so there's earthquakes. That type of earthquake we've had for a long time, but this earthquake will be different than any earthquake has ever been. So great and so mighty. And when I've tried to think about what I think it must be like, here's the way I would imagine it. You could take, if somebody gave you a ball that had been made out of aluminum foil, just the rounded aluminum foil, I don't mean something solid, but just a rounded, almost like a Mylar balloon, but only aluminum foil, and you were to dent it and bend it, you could do that fairly easy, and you could see where you could push in certain areas, and you could get a lot of what has happened on the earth is it's pushed together, and plates have been submerged and some have been pushed up and various things. But God has the ability to take his hands and pull it back apart, so that, again, a giant earthquake, greater and different than any earthquake has ever been, as the earth is pulled back apart and the plates come back out from under each other and come out from under the water and all of that, so that the earth is again rounded, and the earth is again with the water under the earth and the water that's on top of the earth, and there'll be rivers and streams and lakes, but there will be no more sea after this earthquake. And so during the millennial reign, it will be different than it's ever been. So here he says there was a great earthquake, such as has not been since man came to be upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. The great city was split into 3 parts. The cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And I want us to talk a lot about, or mainly tonight, about Babylon the Great and this great city. I believe the Lord has shown me some things about that, so I'm going to come back to that. But on the same subject where it was, I want to go to the next verse, verse 20. And every island fled away. There will be no more islands. And the reason for that is because there will be no more sea. So every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. So if you can imagine the great Rocky Mountains and Smoky Mountains and all of the mountain ranges will cease to exist. And some of those mountains, you know, are so many, maybe even, I don't know how large, how tall they are, but you know, as massive and tall as they are, they will not be found when this has happened. After this earthquake, the mountains and the islands will pass away. And so from this point on, there will be no more sea. That's the way that I'm reading that. And now I'm going to get back into part of that in a little bit, but I should have left that probably along with the other. Now, I'm hearing somebody's microphone. Now he said in verse 19, during this earthquake, the great city was split into 3 parts. And I've studied this for hours and hours and hours, read through all these passages. So in chapter 14, chapter 16, chapter 17, chapter 18, all of these, and even into 19, I guess, talking about Babylon the great city, and all of that, and trying to figure out what's that talking about, and reading it, and then finally, just a little earlier, it began to, some things seem to be coming together for me. So I'm going to be looking at some things, and I'll be sharing some things with you that you may or may not find agreeable, but anyway, consider it. And this is just something that it seems to me like maybe the Lord saying. Now, the great city was split into 3 parts. You know that the Abrahamic religions, or let's say the monotheistic religions, are what? Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Those 3 are being brought back together. Now, they started with the movement of the Pope, in the place for speaking for Christianity, has brought together with the Emir of the United Arab Emirates. They have really worked together to bring Sunni Islam. Now, Catholicism is the largest largest denomination of Christians, and Sunni Islam is the largest denomination of Islam, and they have come together with the Jews, and they have been represented now and have begun to build I guess you would call it a worship center anyway, in Dubai and the United Arab Emirates. And they've worked real hard to bring all that together. And so I've been looking at that, and you also, I've mentioned to you that the largest or the tallest tower now in the world is now in the city of Dubai. And so, and I'm not sure, there's some people believe that this building of towers has something to do with almost goes back to the Tower of Babylon. I'm not sure that I understand all of that, but that represents something in that. And so I've always looked at this and thought, well, maybe when it talks about the great city was split into 3 parts, it could mean that the great city was divided up between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. However, there's another great city, and this is something I didn't think about till just about maybe 30 minutes or an hour ago, and that is there's another city that's called the great city. Now, here's the thing. In chapters 14, 16, 17, and 18, I believe is all, maybe in 19, Babylon is referred to as the great city 7 times. It's referred to as the strong city 1 time. It's called the great city, Babylon, the strong city, in one of the places. But so when it talks about the great city, you think about Babylon the Great, and so Babylon the Great very obviously is a spiritual city. It is a very, and by the way, I know that there are a lot of people say this is not a city, it's talking about a religion, or it's talking about a denomination, or it's talking about this or the other. And yet, over and over and over again, at least, I don't remember exactly how many times, but at least I would say 9 times, maybe 10 times, it says it's a city. The great city, though, here it says, was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And so I was looking at that, but here's the thing to think about on that one of the things I want us to think about. He says the great city was split apart into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. So cities are going to be destroyed. And this is going to be a great cataclysm. There's going to be 1/3 of humanity will die in this at this time. And probably the bulk of that by this earthquake. This earthquake is going to be a devastating thing to all the things where cities have been built up and people have massed. But that was not God's plan, was not what God told him to do. He didn't say, go out and build giant cities. In fact, he told them to scatter out into the entire world. And they are the ones that decided to build the giant cities. And so they build all these cities. And so the cities are going to be destroyed in this when this happens. The cities fall. And then it says Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. Now, Babylon the Great, where's Babylon the Great? So some have said they think that it's in Babylon. Some have said it's in Rome. And in fact, if you go back and read the commentaries, most of them are going to say that they just say almost dogmatically that Babylon the Great is talking about Rome and the Roman Catholic Church. The city is Rome, city built on 7 hills, and they have all these reasons, and there are many things about Rome that fulfills much of what it talks about Babylon the Great. So you can find many things in Babylon about Babylon the Great fulfilled in the city of Rome. And I read through, and some people come up with all of those. The only thing is that most of those stop a little bit early as far as I'm concerned. But I got to looking at this again. Notice he says the great city was split into 3 parts. Earlier, he used, in Revelation chapter 11, verse 8, he also uses that idea of the great city. But what did he, and again, it was a mystery city, but in Revelation chapter 11, verse 8, he says, there dead bodies will lie in the streets of the great city. Now there is the 2 witnesses. You remember the 2 witnesses that they witnessed for 42 months, for the 1260 days, and then they're slain. But then they are raised after they've lain in the streets of the city for 3.5 days or 3 days. Then they are raised back to life and they ascend to heaven. They've not been buried, and they ascend in the sight of everyone. But notice this, they will lie in the streets of the great city. Again, this same thing. Now, this Babylon is the only other place, is the one that's referred to as the great city. And so what other city could be the great city? Well, here it tells us, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. And so you might say, well, why is it mystically called Sodom? And what was it about Sodom? It was the perversion of what God had intended. Why was it about Egypt? And you know how that Egypt failed so many times. And so the great city is mystically called Sodom and Egypt. That might not give you a clue any more than Babylon does. But where was the Lord crucified? And unless you just really spiritualize it, and by doing it you would have to twist, you would have to do violence to the Scripture to be able to say that the Lord was crucified anywhere other than Jerusalem. Am I right on that or not? I mean, does that not make sense to you? Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. I mean, I've been to the place of the place of the skull. I have seen that place. I've seen the place where they said the crosses were outside the city, so that the people coming out would see them on the cross right outside of the city, in the place of the skull. And I don't think could be any doubt about that. So the great city here and on the other places, so it talks about the great city and the other 8 places where it talks about the great city, it's talking about Babylon, the great city. Here it's talking about, I would venture to say, it looks to me clear enough that it's talking about the place where the Lord was crucified. That ought to be all that we need to know. Well, if that is true, then if the great city here is called is Jerusalem, now go back to, it said the great city was split into 3 parts. The last place we saw the great city was the place where the Lord was crucified. Now we see it again in chapter 16, verse 19, and there the great city is split into 3 parts. And Babylon the Great, and and the rest of the places. Now, as we begin to look, it'll be called Babylon the Great City. So I'm going to at least venture to say that there could be reason to believe that Jerusalem is the place that it's talking about. Well, when I got to looking at that, that's why when I first reopened my Bible, that I was in Daniel, because in Daniel, verse 28, Daniel 11:28. Then he will return to the land to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. Now, the Holy Covenant, this is talking about apparently the person who at least is operating under the power of the prince, meaning probably under Satan's power. This is probably the person that is going to be the Antichrist. Now, whether he is at this time or not, we don't know. But he is the person, at least, that will be the Antichrist. He made a covenant, or he confirmed the covenant with the many in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will break that. Now, this is how that takes place. We've looked at this before. Verse 28, his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. So the Holy Covenant was a covenant that, among other things, gave Israel, the land of Israel, to Abraham, to you and to your descendants. And then his descendants were carried on through Isaac and then through Jacob. And so that has been part of that. And now that's all part of that Holy Covenant. And in agreeing with all of that, apparently confirming that covenant, he confirmed the covenant, and probably the Abrahamic covenant is the way I would take that to be. But now his heart is set against that. So we're now almost 1,260 days later, and his heart is set against the Holy Covenant. And so he will take action and then return to his own land at the appointed time. And so there is a time, all of this is appointed by God. At the appointed time, he will return and come into the south. But this last time, it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships from Kittim, meaning from Cyprus, will come against him. Therefore, he will be disheartened and return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant. So he started by confirming the covenant, then he turned against the Holy Covenant, and then now he is enraged at the Holy Covenant and will take action. He will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So those who break it off. And that could very easily fulfill the breaking of the three parts, again, breaking Jerusalem into three parts. Forces from him will arise and desecrate the sanctuary fortress and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. And so it goes on then to talk about the rest of the work of the Antichrist. But what did Jesus say? When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. At this point, you've got to understand. You've got to know what's going on. So that called that to mind when I began to read that part and think about the great city was split into three parts. If it was Jerusalem, what Jerusalem is shared and will be as time goes on, and I think this may happen by something like a UN resolution or some other way, that Jerusalem is going to be shared by the Jews, by Islam, and by Christianity. So Christianity will have a part. And just what they're trying to do right now in Dubai, that they will do in Jerusalem, so that the Jews will be given a portion of the Temple Mount, probably, or maybe they will be given, I don't know, the city of David. Maybe they'll be given Zion Hill. And so they will be given a part. And the Muslims, Islam, has two mosques that are on the Temple Mount. And they do not want to give up any of that. And it has great spiritual meaning to them too. Muhammad supposedly left from the rock that is the rock where Abraham would have sacrificed Isaac, except they believe that it was Ishmael, the Islamists do, but where he would have sacrificed Isaac. That stone, that the Dome of the Rock has been, the reason it's called the Dome of the Rock is because it's over a big rock. That is the rock where Abraham would have slain Isaac, or the Islamists would say Ishmael. And it's supposed to be from that rock that Muhammad ascended into heaven, riding on a white horse, and ascended and then came back. But so it has great spiritual meaning to them. And so Christianity, it has great meaning. And so some great churches are there. And of course, all the meaning it has to Christianity. So all three of these monotheistic religions, all of the Abrahamic religions, consider Jerusalem to be the center, would you say, of their religious experience. That's where it comes from. That's where our Lord was crucified. And so that's what it talks about. So the great city is divided into three parts. The cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. Now that's what we're going to be looking at now in the verses that come. And so I talked to you about the islands fled away, the mountains were not found, the hailstones about the size of 100. Now I want to go to that next. Huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because the plague was extremely severe. Now, when Jesus has come back, when he's coming back, there's a lot of events that are going to take place. And so we may get the idea everything's going to happen in a flash and it's done. But among the other things that happen, as the armies are gathered into the areas to the east of Israel, preparing to fight Jesus and his armies. As they're preparing, and as the saints have gone to meet him in the air, and the trumpet has sounded, and they've gone to meet him in the air, and I don't believe that there's any such thing as a secret in all of that. In the same way they watched Jesus ascend into heaven, he's coming back in like manner. He will be visible in the sky, in the clouds. And so will all of those who are rising, the dead in Christ that rise. I don't think there's going to be anything secret about that. I think it's going to shake the earth. That may be even part of the earthquake. But they're going to ascend up, and those that are alive and remain will be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. And we'll read as we get farther along about how they'll be dressed in white robes, and they'll go to meet him, and they will become, they will go for a time of marriage supper of the Lamb. They'll go to be with him, and he will be coming back. I read to you Isaiah chapter 63 about how it says he went to tread out the winepress alone, and we'll read how that wine came out of the winepress for 200 miles, and that's probably 180 of our miles, but it says for 200 miles. So you can just imagine, how did that take place? What did that look like? This is what I think it looks like. The huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because its plague was extremely severe. I'll tell you now, the ones hit by those hailstones, they're not the ones that are blaspheming God after that. Here's the reason for that. I looked that up, and the largest hailstone that I could find a picture of, I think, was 8 pounds. And it would have been about the size, it looked like about the size of a volleyball. And so I don't know exactly, but like a size of about a volleyball with lumps all around it and all like that, this thing. But it weighed 8 pounds. Now this weighs 100 pounds. And so somebody figured out for a hailstone to weigh 100 pounds, how big would it be? You know how big the bats are more, but most of them are probably 26 inches. The bikes we had that we rode around on as kids were 26 inches. The larger ones, 26 inches. This would be 29 inches. I have one bike that has wheels that are 29 inches. That's big. 29 inches is large, but to be 100 pounds of ice would be 29 inches across. So the diameter of it would be 29 inches. And the speed would be, if I remember right in what I read, that the speed would be in excess of 250 miles. I don't remember what it was exactly, but something like 256 or 258 miles an hour that it would be coming. A hailstone that was the size, that was almost 30 inches in diameter, coming at a speed of over 200 miles an hour, what would happen when it hit the earth? If it hits anything, whatever it hits will be demolished. Is that not true? If it hits a building, if it hits a car, but if it hits people, what's going to happen to them? They will be crushed. And then as those rocks are, those stones, hailstones, as they hit the ground and as they are crushed and begin to melt, and the water of the melting that would be going on with that, you could see why that it says that the blood will flow for 200 miles. That this crushing, this army, 200 million men is what it said back in the trumpets, that it would be 200 million men coming from the east. The ways of the kings of the east would be opened because of the Euphrates River would be dried up. And so this talks about these hailstones. This, I believe, is what it means. And this is Christ himself will call for this hailstorm. And so when it says, I don't think he's going to get down there with his feet and trample on people till the blood comes out, although it does say that the blood will cover his raiment until it is red, and all that goes along with that. But this, and I don't know how far to go with symbolism and say some of this is symbolism and some is not, but if it can be taken literally, I'm going to take it literally. And it says huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because the plague was extremely severe. I'm going to believe that it probably means exactly that. And I could see where that blood will flow in that winepress, in that valley for that far. It's just up to the horses' bridles. And so then one of the angels, he said, now I'm going into chapter 17, verse 1. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke to me, said, come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits upon many waters. Now she's called the great city, she's called the strong city, she's called by a lot of names, But here it begins to introduce her as a prostitute. Then, so why would she be a prostitute? And again, this would fit especially Jerusalem, to me, I would say. Okay, now I know that many, and as I've read the commentaries, that most of them say, well, this is talking about the Catholic Church, or this is talking about the church in general, that all of the church is going to gather together and under this one banner. And that may be true, that most of the church will. By the way, I want to say this. Many people misquote out of these two chapters, out of 17 and 18. Be very careful how you quote some of these things, because it will not contradict what it says in Hebrews chapter 10. And what does it say there? Forsake not the assembling of yourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhort or encourage one another. I try to get the King James mixed in with the other, but encourage one another, exhort one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. And then it talks about the consequences of going on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth. There will not be something that contradicts that. I'm not saying you've got to stay in the organization, but unless God really leads you out, you need to be in a church. You need to be in a congregation. You need to find someone that you can congregate with. And the things that he said in Corinthians and that he said in other places have not become null and void in the last day, in the days where we are. We, in this last days, we need the encouragement that each of us provides. Some of us have one gift, some have another gift, but together we do the work of the church. And so I don't know if you're in what denomination you're in, but in whatever denomination, or whether it's a non-denominational, I'm not so concerned about that. I'm telling you, I would be very careful about leaving that unless you know for certain where you're going. And make sure that you're going to go somewhere where you will encourage people and people will encourage you. I'm very concerned that people misquote and misuse this in such a way as to try to get people to pull out or to leave off. And when it says forsake not, what it's talking about there is don't leave off assembling yourselves together. Don't leave that go as though it were unimportant. I'm not saying, now when I grew up, it had to be 3 times a week. You know that. You just had to be, it had less than 3 times a week. It wasn't probably going to make it. That's what I grew up thinking. However, I'm not saying how many times a week you need to gather together or to assemble together, but I am saying you do need the assembly. You need to be part of an assembly. You need to get somewhere where somebody can encourage you when you need encouragement, and where you can encourage other people when they are in need, and you can practice your gifts and they can practice their gifts, and you can work together. So I'm just saying that. I'm going to start right off by saying, so when it talks about the great harlot, yes, there are many things about the church of today. Are we living in the church age of the church of Laodicea? That's a good possibility that we are. And is in many ways is Christ on the outside of the church, and has the worship of the church in many ways become more about people who are lovers of pleasure, lovers of self, rather than lovers of God. Is that true? Yes, it may. That probably all is true. But having said all of that, the church is. I don't believe that the church is the great harlot. It may be part of that in the time to come. I think that it may join together, because the false prophet is going to represent the church at large, and will give a spiritual support to the Antichrist. Having said all of that, I don't believe that God would have us pull away from the church and pull out, and be very careful about that. Yes, there will be a time when you will be put out of the church. There will be a time when they will probably cause you to be put out. But even then, there's other people who are going to go through the same thing. Find people that you can get together with. And it doesn't say that you've got to have 100 people together in order to be the assembly. The assembly can join together if it's 3 people, where 2 or more are gathered together in my name. 2 or 3 of you are gathered together. So gather with some. I hope that's making some sense to you. And so I'll get off of that soapbox, but I'm very concerned about that. And I'm very concerned that this move is going on to say the church is no longer relevant. I don't need it. It doesn't need me. I don't need it. And it's nothing but a great harlot anyway. So I could just leave, and that's all well and good, and I'll just be a Pharisee of my own, and I'll reject everybody else. Don't do that. Find a way, and God will lead you in all of that. Okay? Did it make you mad? Oh, well, I'm sorry. No, I didn't say that. I don't know that it did. Anyway, but he said, I'll show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Now, this is one who controls, and she will be, in a sense, a city that is that all of the nations. Now, here she's a spiritual leader, but in the things that you see about her, in this chapter you see many things about her that make you realize that she's a spiritual leader. Then we'll get into the next chapter and you'll see that she's an actual city that is a financial center and that it's about finance. And many times, unfortunately, the people of God and the Church of God has gotten involved in finance to the point that have excluded a lot of other things. And I'm not going to go too much farther with that. But the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality. And notice, so he begins to call her a prostitute, a harlot, and talks about her acts of immorality with the kings. All the people on the earth or get drunk by the wine of her immorality. Her immorality is making them, in other words, sharing what should just be for God. What should our worship service be? I was thinking somebody said something like the song, I'm coming back to the heart of worship, let's say. And somebody said, well, where have you been? In other words, what have you been doing then if it was not worship? If our worship becomes about us, about anything else other than about Christ, it's not giving unto God that which should be His. Worship is our act of is our duty before God, to love God supremely, to love God with our whole heart, soul, mind, body, strength, to love God supremely, and to demonstrate that love. That is our act of worship, worship. But we have considered so many things to have worship in these days. And so she's committed acts of immorality. Those who live on the earth are drunk by the wine of her immorality. And so he's going to show that to John. So he carried me away into the Spirit, into a wilderness. I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, here he again takes us all the way back to Daniel. Daniel chapter 7 is the first place that we saw this. We didn't see the woman, but we did see the scarlet beast and the 7 heads and the 10 horns. So that we do see that. She is riding that. Now, I think that this is saying almost exactly the same thing that it talked about when it talked about that I saw the second person of the evil, or the third person of the evil Trinity, the false prophet, as he comes forth, and he has 2 horns like a lamb. The only place that talks, other than talking about Christ, where it talks about the lamb, because Christ is the true Lamb of God, and this one will apparently represent all these religious bodies. I think that he'll not only represent Christianity and Islam, and I think that those two, that probably will be the 2 horns, but I think at first he probably will also try to represent Judaism. However, I think that when things begin to take place, Judaism, many of the Jews are going to recognize a lot of this. And so you can read about that in Zechariah chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 14, where it talks about that revelation, where Christ will reveal himself to the Jews, and they will look upon him whom they've pierced, and they will mourn for him, and talks about the outpouring of the Holy Spirit of God on the Jewish nation. And so that the false prophet will have only two horns. He will have Christianity and Islam, and so they will be, in a sense, in opposition to Judaism. But the scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, and she is sitting on it. She is riding on that. Now, at first, that will be permissible as long as she is possessed, and meaning that the false prophet is possessed by the spirit of a demonic spirit, and the Antichrist is possessed probably by the spirit of Satan, although the dragon also, all three of those have a demonic spirit that will come out of them. And it may be that it's at that point that they are going to recognize her for what she is and will want to burn her with fire and destroy her. But she rides that beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. I've tried to think about the 7 heads. Now, he's going to tell us what the 7 heads are and the 10 horns are and all of that. But when it talks about the 7 heads or 7 mountains, I've thought about the 7 continents. However, Antarctica is hardly fit to be called one of the 7 in a sense. I think there's 1,000, even just part-time residents in Antarctica. It's a big place, but it's not inhabited in a permanent sense. However, the most populous continent is Asia, and Asia has 57% of all of humanity lives in Asia, and there are 3 regions in there's Southeast Asia and Central Asia and whatever, anyway, Eurasia, whatever, and but there's three almost continents, subcontinents in Asia, and so that may be where the 10 heads or the 10 kings come from, but then that it's actually just on 7 continents. I don't know that, but there are also several cities that are called the City of 7 Hills, and that is including Jerusalem as a city of 7 hills, but you can also look that up, and Rome is called the City of 7 Hills. But so is, there's in New York, I think there is the City of 7. You can look up the City of 7 Hills, and you'll find out there's a whole bunch of them. Then it just depends on how big the city is, I guess, maybe to have the 7 hills. But anyway, 7 heads and 10 horns, and God will make that clear when the time comes. The 10 horns, we know for certain what those are. The 7 heads, we know are 7 mountains or 7 hills, as we'll see a little later. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the unclean things of her immorality. And so the ones who, especially early Protestant teachers, have taught that this is very definitely that every one of these things you can find in the Catholic Church. And so they just said, this is talking about Rome. This is the city is Rome. The church, this woman is the Church of Rome, and all of that. I have my doubts about that. It may turn out to be true, may turn out to be right, and I will say that I'm in the minority in saying that it's not, that I don't think it is talking about Rome, but I will show you later why I would say that. But I would say that the majority opinion has always been that this is talking about the Church of Rome. And then the golden cup for her abominations is talking about the chalice and the chalices that she has and the communion of that and the unclean things of her immorality. The wealth she's drawn to herself through these unclean things and through this abominations that are the I guess you'd say the payment for her favors. On her forehead she has a name written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. I doubt that that's what it says. It's a mystery. So what is written on her name, on her head, or whatever. Probably you will, at the time, as time goes on, that will become more clear what it means by Babylon, the great mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly. And so you might say, well, what other places could that be? Now, the witnesses, the drunk with the blood of the saints and with the witnesses of Jesus could be two cities right now that you could think of. And that would be, if there's nothing else went on, you would be able to think of both, again, Jerusalem and Rome, because most of the saints and the witnesses of Jesus were killed in those two cities. But to start with, they were killed. The saints, the beginning of the martyrdom was in Jerusalem, and you remember that's where it started. It's not where it finished, not where and it did continue on into Rome. And so both of those, and both of them have, I believe, could be considered on the runner-up, I guess you would say, to be Babylon the Great. And then he said, when I saw her, I wondered greatly. The word wondered there is almost a word that means admired. I wondered in the fact of it's just, I marveled at her when I saw her. And so that will be what the angel will want to deal with next. And so we'll do that when we come back together. Father, we are grateful for the many blessings you brought upon us. We're thankful. And we do ask, dear Lord, that you will just be with us, dear Lord, and help us to gain understanding. And I know, dear Lord, this has been one of those days that's been a mad rush, and yet you've enabled us, dear Lord, to get together. For some of us, maybe not for the whole time, and each of us have our own challenges, I know in this, but we're grateful, dear Lord, that you've enabled us to overcome those challenges to the degree that we have. Now I do pray that you'll be with us, that you'll guide our hearts and minds to understand. I know there are many events that are going to take place in days soon to come, and we need your wisdom and your guidance, your help, dear Lord, to know exactly what we should do and what we should be. Lead us, guide us, keep us. Bless these who have joined together, and help us, dear Lord, to be a blessing to others. Lead, guide, and direct, and for all that you do, we praise you and thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.